one of the interesting things when we talk about this difference in language and the notion of diversity versus inclusion, I have a certain sense that the idea of diversity was something that we as the organization are going to require of our organization, right? Whereas inclusion is almost from the opposite perspective in terms of we need to create an environment where people want to work, where all people want to work. And it makes you think in terms of how do you create an organization where desirable candidates are not self-selecting out of it.
Good morning, HR. I'm Mike Coffey, president of Imperative, bulletproof background checks with fast and friendly service. And this is the podcast where I talk to business leaders about bringing people together to create value for shareholders, customers, and the community. Please follow, rate, and review Good Morning HR wherever you get your podcast. You can also find us on Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, or at goodmorninghr.com. The last Thursday of the month means it's time to do our wrap-up of recent HR news items. And joining me today is returning guest, Catherine Clifton. Catherine is an attorney and partner in the employment law firm Ross Ganaway Clifton, where she consults with employers about a wide range of employment law issues. Before joining Ross Ganaway Clifton, Catherine spent over 20 years working in public sector employment law here in Texas. Welcome to Good Morning HR, Catherine.
Thank you, Mike. I'm so happy to be back here. I felt like it's been too long since we got to talk.
Yeah, well, it has. Yeah, you were like episode 63, and now we're at 141. So
wow.
It's time flies when you're having fun.
You've been doing a lot of work.
Yeah, well, it's my, all I have to do is ask dumb questions. I just have to find smart people to answer them. So you're here. So welcome back.
Thank you.
So let's start with this Sunshine Raisin case out of California. $2 million sexual harassment agreement to settle a lawsuit brought by the EEOC. When are we going to learn that sexual harassment doesn't fly?
This is one of those cases that it kind of takes you aback because in recent years, we've been much more in the, I don't know, not subtle, but the less overt forms. We're not usually seeing the quid pro quo. We're seeing more hostile work environment or allegations of hostile work environment cases. And this one really, really takes you back that, the things that were going on, that you have the physical contact and the groping and the threats and like just overt quid pro quo. And so that was kind of surprising about it. But it's interesting in another aspect too, actually a couple of other aspects, one of which is the procedure of it, how you get to the EEOC actually files a lawsuit, because most of us as employers have been through that process where you get a charge and you have that opportunity to begin with, usually to go to mediation. You either elect that or you don't. You write your position statement. You wait year and a half, and you get a communication that is dismissal and notice of rights, but it's what we call the right to sue letter usually. And that obviously wasn't the process in this case, because in those cases, it's up to the employee to go out and find an attorney and see if they think it's worth taking after they've waited for the EEOC to do something. And in this case, the EEOC sends a different letter. They send this notice of determination saying they believe that discrimination has occurred. And then they have that opportunity to go into conciliation, which is basically mediation, although now the EEOC is more of a party when mediation at the beginning is where the EEOC is this neutral third party before they've done an investigation. That all happened in this case, and they couldn't settle this at conciliation, which is kind of amazing to me because the facts look so bad.
Right. And that's probably why the EEOC knew they had a slam dunk. They don't want to take cases typically that they think they're going to lose, right? And so to get to the preponderance of evidence or whatever their standard is on the civil side is like, but you've got people here, grabbing and groping employees and making explicit comments over multiple years. Complaints were made and they threatened to fire people for complaining, an overt request for sexual favors. Mm-hmm. I mean, this is more like Mad Men than it is a workplace in the 21st century. So
right.
It's kind of nuts. And so why don't you settle this? Yeah.
Right. And I think the EEOC, in their statement, they really took this position that, hey, this is the most vulnerable group of people. These are people who...
Yeah, these are farm workers. I don't know if I said that earlier.
Right.
Yeah, these are migrant farm workers. And that's probably why they thought they could get away with it. We'll just, they'll just go back home after the season's over.
They got away with it, I think, for a long time. One of the other procedural things that's interesting to me in this one is that it started out as 3 people who complained, 3 people who filed that charge. And by the time this is filed, it's expanded where the EEOC has said, we're representing this entire class of people that were affected because these 3 weren't the only people that experienced this. One of the other things that I think is really interesting in terms of what actually happened in this case is that you had a staffing agency. And I think that's where the Raisin people were like, we weren't the employer. We were using a staffing company. It's their fault. And the EEOC and the court said, no, that's not how this works. But I do think that's interesting. And there was another case that came along from the Fifth Circuit back in the fall that was also possibly even more egregious than this, that have involved the staffing company. And the posture of this one at this point is that now the EEOC has entered into this settlement with the company, but the case with the staffing company is still pending. And the staffing company, I think, is going to make the same argument that the company in the Arredondo case in the Fifth Circuit made, which is, we couldn't have known about this. And I'm not sure where this one ends up because we don't have all the facts. I'm not reading from a transcript, right? But in that case, the court was pretty clear. In the Fifth Circuit case, the court was pretty clear that, well, they never made the employees never made a complaint to the staffing company, and the staffing company had no reason to know this was happening. But at that time, when I was reading the Arredondo case, I thought, okay, but what does this do for them in the future? Because now that staffing company potentially is on notice. If something similar happens again, and in that case, there was actually sexual assault, it was like, that was the one that really smacks you in the face. Like, are you kidding me that this is happening in this day and age? Although I will say this case actually started, I think, in 19 or 20. So it's not as recent as it feels because it takes a while to get through the court system.
But it's still post Me Too.
Absolutely.
I mean, and you would think the Me Too era would have woken even, employers of blue collar employees, who up to it. And the staffing company, I think it's going to be hard for as long as this happened to many people as it happened to say that nobody ever notified them. Nobody ever complained to them or did anything. I mean, now finding those witnesses may be challenging because they're migrant workers, and finding somebody from 2017 or 2018 who came back, and they may well not have been rehired anyway. So
right. And it would be interesting to know what's going on in the discovery in that case, those things that aren't visible to us at this point because the facts haven't been. And usually when we get all the facts is when these cases get past the district court and they're appealed. And that's not where that case is right now. So yeah, that one will be interesting though, if there's further court action on it.
And the thing that would, $2 million is a lot, and one hopes they've got EPLI and it's covering this, or maybe you don't hope that. Maybe you think the dirty bastards have to pay it themselves instead of passing it on to the insurance company. But they also they've got to hire a third party monitor,
right,
to pay it. So they have to have their own ombudsman or their own
right,
basically pay for somebody to report things back to the EEOC and monitor what's going on. You got to do all the training and all of that, update their policies, and then continue to provide reports to the EEOC about any complaints and all of that. I mean, they've taken on a pretty good administrative burden here too, just to keep, to settle this case. And like you said, the staffing agency is apparently still fighting it, and that, maybe that's a decision made, largely by their insurance company, but
maybe they're waiting for visas to expire so that people aren't present. But that's what you brought up about the third party monitor, I thought was really interesting too. And it makes me think about, what does that look like in the workplace when you have a third party there? And in some ways, I think that's very helpful to the employer in this case, because one of the things that we see pretty frequently when we do investigations or when we're helping our clients proceed through investigations of complaints in their workplace is that once people have been, even if they're just a witness in the investigation, they're very concerned about anybody making a claim, And they're contacting me going, well, these people are all concerned. Like, they feel like they shouldn't talk to this person. How do you behave? What do we tell them? And it's like, this is why there's an investigation process, right? And if you haven't done anything wrong, you don't have anything to worry about. But I think about this place, and as long as it's gone on, and if those employees are all still present, just how awkward is that workplace? And I think that's very common. Happens everywhere, right?
Yeah. And I mean, you see it in white collar things where, an investigation about sexual harassment, let's say, turns into a he said, she said. There's no corroborating evidence. There's no previous history of any of this behavior by the person that made the complaint or by the person who the target of the complaint. And you just have to say, we're going to retrain everybody. And this is what we don't tolerate here. These are our policies. And you just move on. So now you've got a complainant who's often not satisfied in those situations. And, you may well have an accused who feels like they were treated unfairly throughout the process because, they're convinced that nothing, very rarely does anybody think they actually did anything wrong. And so you get through all of that. But then those people have to interact. And some, depending on the size of the organization, it's unavoidable. And the rest of the office knows about what's going on, and people, it's awkward, and it's why you want to do all your training up front, because this is the cost of all this drama in your organization is probably more than you want to pay. It's a lot cheaper just to train everybody and say, we're not going to do this.
Absolutely. The lost productivity in dealing with everybody being worried about what's happening because things weren't addressed up front is certainly significant, and it's not one of the costs that people think about. You were talking about, we're kind of talking about how this is awkward, right? And you look back over 25 years of Farragut-Eller and this whole thing where you complain, you do training, and then somebody complains, and then you have an investigation, you take prompt remedial action, et cetera. And I look back on, 20 years ago, if we had somebody complain, they felt so stigmatized by making a complaint. You would see those people. It was really rare for those people to stay in the organization. And you can just see how much pressure that puts on people when they're the complainant. Obviously, it puts a lot of pressure on people when they're the accused. And now it's become more normal. Like, people are less, in many workplaces, people understand this process, which is the result of all the training, maybe the result of having experienced it, to say, this is the process, and I can be comfortable and confident that the process is going to work. And if I didn't do anything wrong, all I do is provide information. But you see a real difference. I think I see a difference in the investigations I do with people who grew up with this. Like you and I, we didn't grow up with this training, right? I tell people the closest thing I had when I went to college, the big thing was date rape. And you had training about that we all went to together, and you sat in it the first week that you're at college, and you have all these very young adults who have just met each other, and then they're addressing this awkward conversation, awkward topic. And how people behave about that is that you make jokes. Same thing happened when we started doing sexual harassment training. And some of the jokes were like, no, are we making things worse here? And now I don't see that at all. People are more comfortable talking about it because it's repetitive. Younger people have grown up with this, right? Through school and come into the workplace, and that's more normalized to them. And just the process, I think there's less stigma to complaining.
Well, the thing, I've got, like you, I've got, my children are all adults and out of the house now, which is nice. But I thought, my number 2 son went off to Houston Ballet to study for 3 years in high school and lived down there offsite in a dorm. And I had this big conversation with him about, sex abuse in the ballet world, but just generally. And you don't, it's never your fault. You don't have to, ever feel bad about it. You can always reach out to us. There's not and we had that whole conversation. He's rolling his eyes the whole time. But that's not a conversation my parents would have ever thought to even have with me, right? And so I think as a society, we recognize these things happen, whereas maybe when I was in the college in the 80s, oh, sure, I saw what happened at rush parties, and I watched all the John Hughes movies. And so, but it didn't, think about it happening in a professional environment when I was first entering the workforce, didn't even really occur to me. And you just didn't think that happened and it's like the Me Too movement. Now we realize how nasty things are in Hollywood. And we've got this idea. So it doesn't surprise us now, whereas it might have before when somebody was proven to have been a bad actor. So the more we pull this stuff out, from behind the couch, and we know it really happens, I think there's a better sense of, okay, well, these things happen and it's not acceptable, but the person to whom it happened to shouldn't be made a pariah. And I think we were a lot more empathetic professionally around those things.
I think that's true. I think that we also see from our witnesses, and I do see a difference that I think is largely correlates to age. I don't want to say it's causative, but there's significant correlation there, that they'll come in and talk about things in investigations that people, Gen X and up, are much more reluctant to talk about. They're less candid historically. We have these younger people who are like, I saw something happen and it didn't affect me personally, but I think it was wrong and I'm going to tell you about it. And you have these younger cohorts that seem like they look out for each other a little bit more. And it's kind of nice to see after, doing this for 25 years and saying, look, all this training has made a difference. Like, you can look back and have that perspective and go, we've come a long way. And then you have a few cases like this where you're like, this is 1975.
Yeah, that's crazy. And let's take a quick break. Good Morning HR is brought to you by Imperative, bulletproof background checks with fast and friendly service. For 25 years, Imperative has helped risk-averse clients make well-informed decisions about the people they involve in their business. Whether that means very thorough pre-employment background checks, due diligence for family offices or private equity firms, or any other kind of business due diligence, if there are people involved, there's risk involved. We help businesses mitigate that risk. You can learn more at imperativeinfo.com. If you're an HRCI or SHRM certified professional, this episode of Good Morning HR has been pre-approved for 3/4 of a recertification credit. To obtain the recertification information, visit goodmorninghr.com and click on Recert Credits. Then select episode 141 and enter the keyword Clifton. That's CLIFTON. And if you're looking for even more recertification credit, check out the webinars page at imperativeinfo.com. Now back to my conversation with Catherine Clifton. Well, the other big news item that's for probably the last 2 months, at least 2 months, has been the future of DEI. We've seen a lot of the tech companies and big corporations that jumped on the DEI bandwagon, especially in 2020 when the George Floyd protests were going on and some cities were literally on fire. And these companies jumped out and said, yeah, we're going to do this. We're going to make all these commitments to DEI. Mm-hmm. Without ever really defining what DEI meant.
Right.
And, and if you ask 5 different people, even in that space, what DEI means, you're going to get 5 different answers. But we, then this past month we had the revelations about how lopsided like Google's artificial intelligence was because of the DEI, stuff that they put on there. You couldn't even ask their image creator to generate a picture of a white guy when you asked it for pictures of the founding fathers or the Catholic Pope. It would always be somebody diverse, and often female and things like that. And we wonder why, there's a reaction against that term DEI because all of this stuff gets swept under it, even the inane stuff. But then on the flip side, you get Florida's Stop Woke Act, which basically went beyond just what the government's doing and made it illegal for private employers, to have programs that dealt with, training and education for their employees on race, color, sex, national origin, Title VII stuff, right? Mm-hmm. And Florida said that's going to be illegal. And 2 companies that wanted to do that training for their employees sued. And the federal district court disagreed with Florida's position. Florida said, hey, we're not regulating speech. It's not a First Amendment issue. We're regulating conduct. And the court basically said, you're relating conduct related to specific ideas that you disagree with. And so this is First Amendment. And then it went to district court, and the district court also agreed with the lower court. And I thought the thing that jumped out at me about that decision was, and as an almost free speech absolutist, they said banning speech on a wide variety of political topics is bad. Banning speech on a wide variety of political viewpoints is worse. A government's desire to protect the ears of its residents is not enough to overcome the right of freedom of expression. And, good for the district court in this one. You rarely hear me say that, but in this case, they made their, I really think, when the government steps in and tells people they can or can't talk about something, we've got a real problem. And this was political posturing on Florida's part. They knew what was going to happen anyway. But when the governor of Florida was running for president, it was kind of apparent. So what's your take on the court's decision on the Stop Woke Act?
Oh, I think they ended up in the clearly right place. How do you say this is conduct when you're saying don't talk about this? Well, so that was really a reach. I think the court got it right. The 11th Circuit got it right. One of the things that's always interesting to me about Florida cases is that they're closer to us. And by closer to us, I mean the 11th Circuit was carved out of the 5th Circuit. So when we're sitting here in the 5th Circuit, what the 11th Circuit does is still based on a lot of the jurisprudence that initially came out of the 5th Circuit. And so it's always a closer connection between cases out of Florida and Texas. Plus, you have some similarities in the political environment and some of the attitudes and so forth. I think you're right about it being posturing, but also, and probably campaigning, it was about employees, but also about students. And so there's a corollary case that came to the same place in the district court. And I think it's going to go to the circuit in June, maybe. I anticipate that it's going to end up in the same place, although...
Because it's talking about private universities, not just public universities, right?
This is high schools. It's all public education.
Oh.
I don't know about the private education one, but it is. It's going to be heard in the context of the Harvard case from last summer, right? But based on what the language we saw from the 11th Circuit, I don't imagine this is going to end up any place different, because this is about speech. That law is about speech. And the Harvard case was about admissions decisions based on racial conscious criteria. So I don't think there's a big influence there, but I do think that that's kind of easy for people to conflate those things, right?
The thing about the Harvard case was, I believe, a wake-up call for a lot of people who are sympathetic to the idea of moving our society past the racial prejudices we've had and even looking for ways to mitigate, implicit bias and all of that. And I'm on board with that. But when you start flipping it to the other side where, and everybody says there's no such thing as reverse discrimination. Well, there is. And I think, we saw some of that in the Harvard case. And so I understand why employers, and I think that was the wake-up call for employers, we do have Title VII we have to pay attention to. And Title VII, we always talk about protected categories, but the protected categories are the categories themselves, not the different groups inside the categories.
Right.
And I think that's just beginning to dawn on people that, there is such thing as reverse discrimination. We can't do it. And in fact, the next case we're going to talk about was a reverse discrimination case.
Right.
This guy, David Duvall, was an executive with a healthcare system called Novant Health. And according to testimony in the case, he's a white guy who got fired abruptly in 2018, and he was replaced by a white woman and a black woman. And he didn't have any previously addressed performance issues and was only told, the company's going in a different direction by the CEO. And in and of itself, none of that's a giant red flag, right? We make decisions sometimes about executives. They're not the right fit and we move them out. And, but I think the context matters. And the fact that in 2015, Novant Health implemented what they called a diversity and equity strategic plan. And part of that plan, as it's developed over the years, is they've set a strategic or a company goal of making sure their executive ranks match the racial and gender composition of their community. And when you go, and they say, oh, it's not a quota, but you say X percent of our community is of this gender or of this color or racial background or whatever, and and our goal is to match that. Well, what are the incentives here? And so David Duvall claimed that he was fired to make room in the executive ranks for women and minorities. And this goes back to documentation when you terminate somebody too, because the company came back and said, oh no, we had these reasons.
Right.
But they were all documented after the fact. They're, years after the fact, like when they show up for this, for their depositions kind of thing. And so maybe they were legit, maybe they weren't, but the court didn't buy it at all. The lower court didn't, and the circuit court didn't. And so the case, and they, so they affirmed the decision on his behalf. But what's your take on that kind of situation?
Well, I think, what we call reverse discrimination, I kind of had an obverse thought from what you did, that there really is no reverse discrimination. It's all just discrimination.
Right.
Because of exactly what you pointed out, that Title VII doesn't say, oh, you can't discriminate against this specific, race or national origin. It's, you can't make decisions based on race. You can't make decisions based on sex. So, that's always been implicit to me. But yes, I've heard that before, that, oh, well, no. A white male can't make a claim. Well,
right.
It's patently untrue. And he can make a successful claim.
And I'll say that I've heard DEI people who've done the work and are out there, promoting themselves as consultants or whatever. I've heard them say it's not possible to discriminate against a white person. Right. I mean, because the power structures and all that, blah, blah, blah. But if I'm the one guy who's losing his job because of something that had nothing to do with any characteristic I had control of, that's discrimination. And you did discriminate against me.
And this is one of those, and this is true in, I think, pretty much every case where bad facts make bad law. To your point earlier, they talked about in the case, like, he was, from all reports, an exemplary employee, did amazing things, was recognized nationally for the work that he had done with that particular company. He had some interesting fallout afterwards from this, because then he goes and gets hired by someone else. He files suit against this employer, and his new employer terminates him for suing, and then can't find a job after that, which is all included in this case, which is kind of interesting because that's all stuff that happened after the fact and didn't have anything to do with that employer. But, this is where we tell people, you've got to be consistent. Whatever the truth is, that's the truth. And in this case, it looks bad when you have told 3 different stories. And his employer did. His employer told him at the time, we're just going in a different direction. Then he kind of doubles down and tells a third party later, oh, this guy's great. It's just that there were changes going on in the company, but he's fantastic and I would hire him again. And then he says in his deposition and on the stand, well, he choked during this presentation and he didn't show up for some of these meetings, which was an interesting change in strategy in terms of that case. But I also look at this case from kind of my side of things and say, you may have really had some performance concerns with this person, but they didn't document them.
And you apparently didn't even address them because, right. You don't have anybody saying, hey, we had a conversation around this thing before or anything.
Exactly. So. And this particular individual was on the committee, on their DEI committee internally, and was like very well aware of those conversations. I did think it was interesting that they made the point, oh, no, it's not a quota, because a quota is something imposed on you from the outside. These are our targets, and targets are fine. But it does go to this issue of we kind of recognize, right, as a society that there are some systemic inequities, and you have this notion of generational wealth that isn't the same across all races, all national origins, and that
Right.
sort of thing. And this desire to, how do we change this? And I think that's been the struggle for DEI initiatives is we want to do something, but what are we going to do? Because a lot of them have always been stymied by the, well, now are you going to, what is your criteria for making decisions? And if you're still going based on merit, how do you get to where you want to go?
Right.
And I kind of think the same thing as the conversation changes to inclusion. What does that look like?
Well, I mean, and my argument has been that the whole reason to pay attention to DEI. I mean, corporations are not social justice organizations, and so you've got to make the business case, and the business case is, I want the broadest, most qualified talent pool available, and if I'm letting some managers' biases or outright prejudices limit that, then that's hurting the company. And then, and I think we've largely moved past outright discrimination. There's still, we still see disparate impact on occasion from, policies that maybe we didn't even intend to create a disparate impact. And that was just, we fix those. But the real issue is, wherever we can find it, we need to mitigate these biases so that we get the best talent we can get. And then we need the inclusion. And the inclusion to me means everyone feels included, right? So you can come to work and you don't have to worry that when it's time to pray and you go off someplace privately to do your daily prayer, you're gonna have a negative ramification about that. Inclusion doesn't mean everybody's on board with it and thinks you're amazing and lovely because of your whatever your religious outlook is, or because of your sexual orientation or any of those things. We don't all have to love everything about everybody else, but we need everybody to work together to accomplish the organization's mission. And when that's a problem, that's where we have to figure out, how do we fix this? Because I need to retain my best employees. I need to be this place where people are productive and they want to come to work. That's the business case for the inclusion side. And that's what we ought to be focusing on. And as soon as DEI turned down this path where it was, as we've seen in some of these other cases, where it was, this group of people is wrong, and they don't have any choice, but we're making these essentialist arguments about, this minority group has always been underprivileged and is always put upon, or this group has always taken advantage and has this level of privilege, which is going to vary differently from person to person. And so, my white sons had a lot more privilege than a lot of white people who grew up in Appalachia with real poor schools and low economics. And so, that's just going to be different for every person. So whenever we start talking about people in these broad categories,
Absolutely.
we miss what we're actually doing to trying to hire. So
right. And
off my soapbox, go ahead.
no, I mean, I agree with you. And I think that's one of the mistakes that we make, especially about like people who are in a different demographic for us than us, that we tend to think they all have the same perspectives and the same beliefs, the same skills, talents, attributes, etc. Even though within our own demographic, we can see extraordinary differences, right? But we tend to have that that, well, if you're in this category, then you're going to react the same way every other person in that category does. And there's just no such thing. I think that's difficult to put a program together that's going to address all the myriad differences among people.
Right. What we need to teach people is care about the work and figure out how you get along with the other competent people who are on your team and that you have to interact with. And maybe that is understanding macroaggressions. If I'm clueless about, a black female's hair texture, and I reach up and want to touch it because I've never seen it before. Yeah, I get that. That would creep me out if somebody reached up and touched my gray hair, which is actually dyed this morning, so it's not quite so gray. But that would be offensive, right? And so let's learn those things as we go along. But we don't have to. I think it hurts us when we overgeneralize about people, and
Absolutely.
we just want to get builds brawls. And then there was the case of this month, a reverse discrimination case was dismissed. This an employee claimed that what the Colorado Department of Corrections was doing some DEI training, and he filed suit saying that the program actually, and apparently did, from what I understood from the testimony, state that all whites are racist and that white individuals created the concept of race in order to justify the oppression of people of color. And so for a technical reason, really, as failure to state a claim, the case was dismissed. But what was really interesting, the court said Mr. Young's objections to the contents of the DEI training are not unreasonable. And then they went on to say race-based training programs that can create hostile workplaces when official policy is combined with ongoing stereotyping and explicit or implicit expectations of discriminatory treatment. And when this came out, a lot of people were kind of freaking out on the internet that this was, this is setting us back 20 years or 50 years. But it just seems like obvious stuff to me, right? That we don't want to talk about people in these broad categories.
And there's also that issue of how do you do inclusivity? How do you talk to people? And this issue that, like what happens here, this guy files suit because he's offended. He feels attacked, right? Because if you think I need training, then you must think I'm wrong, that I don't know how to do this, that I don't know how to treat other people, or that you're saying overtly that, I'm racist. And people really don't like being told that or feeling that they're being told that. And I think that's one of the challenges for, I don't know if it's the DEI movement or we're now calling it the inclusivity movement, to how do you communicate this? How do you get to be effective in that when it's such a charged subject? And how do you approach that? I think sometimes the most effective way you help people with perspective, and I think that's a lot of what it is just giving somebody some additional perspective, letting them see things from the perspective of a coworker who's differently situated than they are when they just haven't considered it before. And how do you do that? It seems like one-on-one conversations occasionally over the course of time are probably the most effective for that. And that's not something that you can say, look, here's our program.
Right. And that it goes back to my early career. I'm always reminded that I worked alongside a professional who happened to be gay. And I didn't realize he was gay when we started working together. And, I'm from Texas and I was young and a product of my background. And I was kind of shocked when I found out he was gay. And then it kind of sunk in that, oh, he's gay. Okay. It didn't really make a difference,
right,
but
because he's still a person, right?
It's not, because I had my preconception of what that was like. And so I think the more we work alongside people who are very different from us,
right,
and we learn to appreciate them, not because of phenotypic traits or their religion or whatever it is, but because they're contributing to the organization and the team and our mutual success. Suddenly that's how if you want to deprogram people from their biases, I think that's how you have to do it, right? That, you got to get them out of the habituation of how you think about people. And that's going to come from experience. Throwing somebody in a conference room for 8 hours is just, all that's going to do is just cement them and create bitterness
right,
of that about about this whole environment. They're not going to be willing to learn and observe what other people are really like. So
right. And I think that's got to be a frustration because this is a slow process for change. And when you want to come in and say, hey, we're going to make this change and we're going to do it through these initiatives, but realistically, you do have Title VII, but Title VII. And Title VII exists for a reason, and it does have universal applicability. And that's the way it was written. So I do think it's a challenge for people who are trying to gain ground in that direction. And I would like to think that someone can come up with better strategies, more effective strategies that can be more efficient in that. I don't have any ideas for how to solve that problem.
Well, especially when you're talking about systemic stuff. And I've got a conference presentation. I talk about, mitigating bias in the employee selection process. And it's got to be in your systems. And so what can we change in our systems that, certainly in how we train managers, but beyond that, how we word our job descriptions. Does this attract a diverse workforce, or are we signaling to some folks, even if we don't intend to, yeah, you shouldn't apply for this, and when, there's nothing wrong with training people to question why are they uncomfortable with it. When you're talking to an applicant, what is it about? I don't like this applicant. Well, why? Well, they didn't look me in the eye. Well, is that an essential part of this job, or are we just having a problem because they didn't look you in the eye? They don't have the firm handshake or those kind of things. And those are biases just as much as anything, and they're unrelated to the job. So the more we get people to focus on competencies, and eliminate, even consider, I've got no problem with using your ATS to eliminate, the names, candidates' names and gender references in whatever the hiring authority receives. That all makes sense to me. But at some point, they're going to have to meet this person, and they've got to be grown-ups and say, okay, I've got this check in my gut about this person, or I really like this person. And you got to ask, why do I like them so much? Why are they so great? And is it competence related, or is it really related to the job? Or is it me just liking this person because they've got the same background as me, which doesn't have anything to do with doing the job?
Well, and I think that's a good point too, especially, and there's probably a little bit of variation. If you, as the interviewer, held that job that you are now hiring for, then I think you have a greater propensity to say, someone like me will be successful in this role because I was successful, and you have to be like me to do this job. And I think everybody, to some degree, forms their job, shapes their job around themselves and around the things that they are naturally easier for them, that they like to do more. And there's an advantage to that, right? There's an advantage for the employer that, hey, this person's really working to their strengths, and that's where you want them to be. But that also means that everybody can do the job a little bit differently. And as long as they're covering the essential functions in a way that's sufficient, then that's okay. That variety gives you some advantage too.
Yeah. And that person who does it a little differently may turn out to be a better performer than the guy who went to the same school as I did, or the same church as I did, or any of those things that are totally unrelated to actually being able to do the job.
Or may bring you a perspective that when you have that interaction with them, and they can explain something to you in a way that you see something you just didn't see before, and that's ultimately advantageous for your company.
Yeah.
I think that one of the interesting things when we talk about this difference in language and the notion of diversity versus inclusion, I have a certain sense that the idea of diversity was something that we as the organization are going to require of our organization, right? Whereas inclusion is almost from the opposite perspective, in terms of we need to create an environment where people want to work, where all people want to work. And it makes you think in terms of, how do you create an organization where desirable candidates are not self-selecting out of it?
Right.
Which then you think, well, how do you do that? And I tend to think there are certain jobs, and I always think about firefighting. Like, that is white male. It's still predominantly white male. And they have made a lot of efforts. A lot of organizations have made efforts to say, how do we get more women into this? How do we get people who aren't white into this? How do we get greater racial diversity? Because we look at these reports and we don't match our community. And there is something to be said for that helps in your service, especially on the paramedic side, that you match your community. So it's certainly a valid thing, but how do you attract these people into those jobs?
And that's what it boils down to, though. It's about your outreach and your recruiting efforts and those things. And that's not discriminatory to,
Right.
Hey, we're going to really, we're going to go out of our way to recruit out of our own community. And maybe that means we build training programs, but we do not create training programs for people of color. Again, I think that's going to be the next big Title VII thing, because, you're seeing those, you see a lot of those kind of programs. And I think that's on its face about, at least on Title VII, we're going to do job training for people.
When we talk about fire service, it's also generational. These are things that it's something that runs in families. And so you have people that have grown up seeing that as a job and seeing aspects of it that they find desirable. And so you've got brothers and sons and that sort of thing. And then that's where a lot of your candidates come from. So then how can you get that same sort of perspective and experience for the rest of a potential workforce to say, let's tell you about what's good about this and how all this works? And I think it's a lot more informational, and it probably doesn't work as well to put that down on a piece of paper. You need kind of somehow a demonstration, a video, an explanation, one-on-one conversations with people, or one-on-three conversations with people about, here's what's great about this work. Or people who have had some individual experience with that profession in their life and said, I want to do that because that person did something good for my family, did something good for me. I see them as being heroic. I see that as being something I want to do, that I want to serve the community. But I think that's requires a lot more thought about our jobs and our organizations in how do we make that effort in recruitment. And we've talked about that before, right? That, hey, recruitment is where you do that. Make sure that you are getting broad recruitment to all of your demographics, especially when your numbers say, hey, we're really low, or we're really out of sync with our community. And think, where do you go to do that? And some of that's relationship building with your community.
Well, hey, we've run way over time, but thank you so much for giving me a big chunk of your afternoon today, Catherine.
I enjoyed it. Thank you, Mike.
And thank you for listening. You can comment on this episode or search our previous episodes at goodmorninghr.com or on Facebook, Instagram, or YouTube. And don't forget to follow us wherever you get your podcast. Rob Upchurch is our technical producer, and you can reach him at robmakespods.com. And thank you to Imperative's marketing coordinator, Marianne Hernandez, who keeps the trains running on time. And I'm Mike Coffey. As always, don't hesitate to reach out if I can be of service to you personally or professionally. I'll see you next week, and until then, be well, do good, and keep your chin up.